Hi all, I'm Devansh. I will be training you on risk management. The content of this training will be what is risk, what is issue, how they are different, what are different risk governance model, what are the different kind of response strategies to risk, how do we mitigate risk, and what is a risk register. And we will be having a practical session in this training, different measurement methodologies, what are the components of risk register, and what are specific areas that a leadership team look for, which is different from project management or program management risk components. And we will do a practical, as I said, on how do we create a risk register. We will also touch upon risk mitigation strategy and risk mitigation process, and we will also have a small touch upon on how do we scale risk and various risk models. Okay, what we will not touch in this session is how to create an issue log. Now, what is risk? If we talk in general sense, risk is something that is uncertain, something that is based on assumptions and guesses. When our chances of success depends upon something which we cannot completely control, that's risk. Risk is an uncertain event or a condition. If that occurs, if that happens, it may have a positive or a negative impact on the project, or on at least one of the objectives of the project. Now, when I say if there is a risk, and if that happens, it may have a positive or a negative impact. Most of you must be thinking that why a risk will have a positive impact. Now, let us say that um, we forecasted that we will be able to sell 1,000 units of a particular laptop in a particular target market, right? But when we launched that particular laptop, we anticipated the demand will be one for 1,000 laptops, but we had a risk. We thought the risk will be 10% deviation from the demand. So we had produced 1,100 laptops, 10% more, because that was the deviation. But we see that demand was so high that we needed to manufacture 2,000 laptops. That was a risk, right? Now this is a positive impact that the demand has increased. But on the negative side, we cannot have this supply, we cannot meet this demand. So the uncertain event or any condition that can have a positive or negative impact on at least one of the objectives, that is called risk, or anything that deviates from the plan. In a very layman term, anything that deviates from the plan, that's risk. Right? Now, let's understand what is an issue. Issue is something that is impacting the project right now. In my previous example, when we anticipated that the demand will be approximately 1,000, the 10% deviation, so we had manufactured 1,100 laptops, but now the actual demand after seeing the laptop is 2,000. Now, we are not able to meet this demand. There's a supply crunch. This is an issue, right? This issue has to be resolved right now. Now, if we see like what is the difference between risk and issue? Risk is something uncertain because we have to see that in the future, right? So anything that's happening in the future and we cannot completely control that. That's the uncontrolled part, is the risk part. However, issues are very certain because that's happening right now, right? It is not something that will deviate from the plan. That will be risk if it will deviate from the plan in the future, right? If it has already deviated from the plan right now in the current situation, that is an issue. That is why risk has to be predicted, right? We need to assess the probability of that risk. However, issue cannot be predicted because it's happening right now. It's in your hand. You need to identify what is the issue, right? And as we discussed, risk may have a positive or negative impact, but on the other hand, if there's an issue, it definitely has a negative impact. An issue cannot be a positive impact, cannot have a positive impact. Now, for risk, As that is happening in the future, we can have a mitigation plan. But as issue has already happened, so we cannot have a mitigation plan. We cannot mitigate that. That has already happened. So we need to have an action plan. For risk management, we create a risk register. For issue, we create an issue log. Now let's take another example. Let us say that I'm managing a project and I anticipate that in a team of 10, two of my team members are potential attrition case, right? They might drop in the paper in the mid of the project. That is a risk. Now, if these people in the middle of the project, if they already drop the paper, the project is running, that becomes an issue. You guys are clear on this? Now, looking at the risk governance model, there are various ways of risk governance. One is a very informal model. You follow your gut. Let me give a very easy example to connect. When you are going from destination A to destination point A to point B using a vehicle, right? You are putting yourself in the risk. You can fall down or you can meet an accident, right? There's a risk. Now you use your gut and you take the safest route. You drive safely to mitigate it. That's you're using your gut, right? Or from the project point of view, let's say in the team of 10, when you thought that two people will actually drop in the paper, two people are the potential attrition case. So how do you mitigate that? You do the KT transfer, right? Knowledge transfer, so that you distribute their all knowledge in the other 8 team members, so that even if they drop in the paper, your project is not that high at risk. Right? That's informal model. You use your gut, a little bit of calculation and stuff, and you make your own mitigation plan. In a policy-based model, what happens is there is a single policy which is org-wide. One of the classic example that I can give in one of the company that I was working in, it had a policy of 15% for the business continuation planning. Now, if I'm running a project of 100 people, 15%, I will be allotted 15% seat in another location. So if in location A, there is an earthquake, a tsunami or something, or the infrastructure down, I can still have 15% people in the other location who can still do the bare minimum task and keep the project running, right? That's policy-based model. One policy applies to all. But when we look at the custom-based model, it can actually depend upon project to project. Some project might not be as critical as the other one. The projects which are not at all critical, they can have 0% BCP seats. The projects which are very critical, they can have more than 25% of 25%. Let's take example of ATC, air traffic controller. If there are 20 people in an air traffic controller, and if there's infrastructure down, we cannot let the planes hanging high in the sky. They have to come down. So somebody has to govern them. We cannot say that if there were 20 people in the ATC, now it can be taken care by another 15% people sitting in some other locations. It's not possible. So we need to have another 20 people in some other location to take care of all the planes, right? So that's called custom model. On the basis of project and the situation, you change a model. And a combination of policy-based model and the custom model is the hybrid model. In the hybrid model, you use your what the company says, plus on the basis of what is the current situation, you design a policy and you build your risk model on the basis of that. What are risk response strategies? Now, there are 4 ways of responding to the risk. One is let's avoid the risk completely. A very classic example is one of the nuclear reactor that got damaged during tsunami in Japan. One of the way to avoid that kind of risk in the future is let's not build the nuclear reactors in the area which are earthquake or tsunami prone, right? That's one way of avoiding it. Mitigate. Now, an example, when I said 2 people might drop in the paper, we can mitigate it by replacing these 2 resources by other resources. which will have much lesser probability of dropping the paper. We can mitigate that risk. Transfer. Let us say that I buy an insurance. Okay, let's say I'm sending a parcel of worth $100 million from point A to point B via ship, and the ship moves through Pacific, and there are chances my parcel might get damaged if there's a storm and stuff. So what I can do is I can transfer the risk and I buy an insurance. Correct? So this way we transfer the risk to an insurance company. Accept the risk. When we accept the risk, we do not take any action. We kind of surrender to the situation. Let us handle. One of the classic example when we always accept the risk is when we actually drive a motorbike or a car, move from point A to point B. There are always chances of accident, but we accept. Let's accept and move forward. But yes, sometimes in this case we mitigate it by wearing a helmet or by wearing a seatbelt, leg guard and stuff, right? Or in the ship example, when we are transporting our shipping container from point A to point B, we don't take insurance. We accept the risk. Okay, let's accept it. Whatever happens, we'll take it. Right? But that's not a very good way of responding to a risk, because we suffer losses if that risk actually happens, if that situation actually happens. So accept the risk is good response when the risk is very low, right? Then you accept it. Even if it happens, the impact is low. So these are 4 different ways that we respond to risk. Now, whenever I was giving an example, I was talking about mitigating the risk, right? So why mitigating a risk is important? When we identify all the risk which is applicable to our objective that we are trying to achieve or to the project, our work does not stop there. We need to understand that if we have identified a risk, we need to create a risk response strategy, yeah, which we just discussed. How will we respond to that risk? And when we have that strategy in place, we want to identify the measures, the control measures that we want to apply to mitigate that risk. Let's say if that risk situation happens and we are going to lose $1 million, how do we mitigate that risk? Can I 100% avoid that, or can I mitigate? Can I reduce the impact or the damage that can happen because of that risk? That's called applying control. So it is like applying a check or a prevention measures to reduce the impact of a particular risk. And most of the organization have a threshold unit, right? Threshold in logistics, there is a threshold unit. In software development, there is a threshold unit. In software development, you cannot give more than 10 bug in the second level, or in a customer journey testing. Not more than 3 bug can go in the client deployed software, right? So there is a threshold. Whenever we think that it will actually exceed that threshold unit, or which is set by the organization, we must have a risk mitigation plan in place. Now, one of the most important thing a project manager actually creates is a risk register. There are 2 ways of measuring the risk. One is qualitative and one is quantitative. We will check that in subsequent slides. Now, one of the definitions which I have made for risk register is it is a documented way of capturing projects' qualitative and quantitative measures, which implies to risk, along with the mitigation plan to take action so that we can minimize the negative impact of the project. Right? Now, why do we want to have a risk register separately? The reason being, there are conditions which we are not actually mentioning in the project plan. When we are making a project plan, we write down there are 10 resources and we have, let's say 4 months, and these are the quality standards, and we create a plan that how we are going to achieve it, right? In a waterfall methodology. Now, we don't, we don't add the component like out of these 10, 2 people might drop in the paper in between, right? And then what we will do? We don't capture that in the project plan. We don't capture what will happen if my infrastructure is down. We are not capturing that. What will happen if there's an earthquake? There was a flood situation in Chennai in 2000 and India, Chennai in 2016, yeah, 2016 in the end of the year. There was a huge risk for one of the MNCs which I was working in that point of time, and a couple of guys had to fly in to other location to carry on the minimum required work of the project. And that point of time, company had used not the single policy. Let me take you back on that slide. So the second model, policy-based model, right? The company MNC had a custom model. It was project-based, and there were more than 15% people who were working from a different location when the Chennai flood happened. Now, as we know that we need to have a risk register ready, what are the important components? Now, these components are not the line on the stone. You can have the components on the basis of what is required in your project. These components may change, but most of the parameters which I have captured are kind of standard parameters. You need to have them. First and foremost, what is risk? Like what that risk that we are capturing, and a little definition around it, that what this risk is all about and why this is a risk. And you can actually categorize those risks. If it's a very big project, you might have certain risk in the human resource category, you might have certain risk in the infrastructure category, you might have certain risk in the leadership category, you might have certain risk in the client side category, in the communication category. The categories can depend. You need to use your wisdom and knowledge about the project and create your own category. You need to capture what will cause this risk. What is the probability that risk will happen? Is it, let's say, tsunami, earthquake? You need to use a judgment and the knowledge from knowledge which is available. Probability of tsunami in Japan is in this year is 1%. So you need to use that. What will the impact of tsunami if that happens? High impact. The probability is very low, but the impact will be very high, right? What will propose response? Do you have a BCP in place? 15% people will be working from some other location, Osaka, or maybe 50% working from completely different continent, or maybe from another country, India. And who is the owner? If this risk happen, who is the go-to person? What is his knowledge? It's not very, it is important depending on the kind of project you are handling, but in IT, we do not, in IT industry, we do not take this component in picture. Mitigation plan is important, but again, I have not seen most of the project managers actually using the mitigation plan. And status of the risk, it is completely depends upon you whether you want to have this kind of status or not. Usually the status is whether this was discussed with the stakeholders or not. Status is very important when you're creating an issue log, whether status is open or under discussion or closed, right? When we are taking a scientific approach to define what is the probability and impact, it is also important to understand the number around probability and impact. It corely depend upon what is the knowledge of the risk owner. If his knowledge is low, let's say if my knowledge is low in understanding what are the chances of my resources dropping the paper, or if my chances are low, how to access the government data to check the probability of tsunami happening or the flood happening, then of course I will not be keying in the right number for probability and impact, correct? Or what is the impact of flood on the project? flood happening, that is flood, whether like what is the probability of flood, that's the government data that is readily available. But what is the impact of the flood on this project? If my knowledge is low in this subject, then owner's knowledge, the degree of owner's knowledge should be taken into risk mitigation plan. Now, I have not seen this happening in the IT industry. However, I'm certain there are a couple of software projects which are for for flight industry, like aeroplane and stuff. Maybe larger projects, high value projects. I think they must be taking the owner's knowledge into picture. Now, we have been discussing about the project risk, and there must be a risk register at the program level, and there should be a risk register which a leadership team carries. Now, I don't see that happening as well. However, the components in risk register for project and for program and for leadership are very different. I'm not going to discuss these. However, if you look at the leadership component, these are communication, negotiation, persuasion, cross-team cohesion, client relationship, which impact on the entire BU. These are the components which are very different from, if you see, the project risk, skill, resource availability, attrition, timeline, and stuff. So my suggestion is we should definitely have a risk register at all the levels. Now, what are the steps of creating a risk register? And though we have a slide, however, by this time I'm sure you already are in a you can actually create your own steps how to create a risk register. So first is you identify the risk. You give a description around it, write down the details. Determine what is the probability of that risk, and if that risk happens, what will be the impact? How are you going to respond to that risk? How are you going to document it? Who will be the owner, right? And how are you going to communicate to the stakeholders? Usually in most of the project, MS Excel and MS Project are not MS Project, like less than 5% people have been using MS Project, but largely 95% population in IT industry use MS Excel. That's a very easy tool as well. Jira also you can use, but you need to add that field. It's not available on its own. Okay. Now, as we discussed in the starting, if we have a risk register, it is important to have a mitigation plan around it, right? And how do we uh, create a mitigation plan? Is evaluate what is the likelihood, right? What are the chances of that particular risk happening? If that happens, what's the kind of impact? Brainstorm with the team that what kind of control measures we can actually implement around it, so that we can actually reduce the likelihood, or if not likelihood, how we can reduce the impact. Now, once we have the control measures in place, we must assess what will be the benefit, right? The benefit, let's say if we have XYZ control, it's going to cost us 1 million, but if that risk actually happens, we will save $100 million, right? So our actual cost is only $99 million. Let me give you an example of a shipment container where laptops are going from China to, let's say, Greece to US, and the container value is $100 million. And if we insure it, it's going to cost us only $0.1 million. If we lose that container in the storm, we are going to lose $100 million. That's too much of risk, right? So it's better to transfer that risk to insurance company. And once we have this risk mitigation plan in place, it is important to assess what is the residual of that risk, right? It is kind of impossible to mitigate the risk 100%. So whatever we have mitigated, whatever is remaining is our residual risk. Okay, I discussed about various ways of risk models. I've tried to use a design thinking approach to make it as simple as possible. Now, there are 5 major components in a risk model. The probability. What is the probability of that risk to happen? Second is impact. If the risk happens, what will be the impact on the objective or on the project? Third is mitigation factor. How much effort will it take for us to mitigate that risk? Fourth, knowledge. How much knowledge the risk owner has to actually mitigate that risk. Correct? A person with lesser knowledge will be able to mitigate that risk with a lesser degree. An expert who has expert knowledge on that risk factor might be able to reduce the impact or mitigate that risk close to 100%. As I said previously, it will never be 100%. But an expert will be able to mitigate that risk to a very large extent. Last is weightage. What is the weightage of that risk on our project or on our objective? Right? Now, we need to calculate the risk for a particular project in terms of numbers. Now, difficult part is, regardless which model you are implementing, you can implement all the model in one project, but regardless which model you're implementing, that depends upon what kind of project you're running, how complex it is, what's the value of the project in terms of dollar, how big is the project, how widespread is the project, multi-stakeholder, multi-client, multi-geography, right? So we need to use our judgment, our knowledge to pick the right model. I will be talking about 2-3 different models which are very specific to IT industry. Okay. Let me take you to Excel. One of the risk model which is very famous in IT industry is this, where we write down all the risk of a particular project. We assign a value. We assign the weightage. The weightage should always add up to 100, correct? And the value is on the scale of 1 to 5. And multiplying the value with the weightage will give you the net risk exposure. And when you add all that, you actually get the risk of the particular project. Now, we need to understand this automatically 3.40, which is red. If it was 1, it would have become green. Let me do Control Z. Now, how do we distribute this risk, whether it is like this number, whether it is low risk, medium risk, or high risk? Now, the approach that I take, you can have a different approach altogether. I use a distribution of 30, 40, and 30. If it is a distribution of lower 30, it's a low risk. If it is in the middle 40, lower 30 is low risk, upper 30 is high risk. Whatever is in between is the moderate risk. 30 plus 30 is 60. 100 minus 60 is 40. Now, as it is a scale of 1 to 5, so equals 5 into 30% is 1.5. That's why I see 0 to 1.5 is low risk. And then again, for the upper 30, it will be 1.5. So 3.5 to 5 is high risk. Whatever is in between, which is 1.5 to 3.5, is a moderate risk. Okay. So that's why you see here it shows 3.40 and it is showing as high risk. Maybe you can take it as upper 40. So it will be a different number, equals 5 into 40%. So it will be 2. So 3 to 5 will be high. 3 to 5 will show as high risk. So here it will be 1.5 to 3 as moderate risk. Now you can have your 40, 40, 80. Okay, sorry, it's 30. Okay, so you can have your own judgment, your own measure. As we discussed in one of the slides, most of the companies have their own risk measurements, right? There is a threshold. Some companies say the threshold is 4, some companies say the threshold is 3, sometimes it's 3.5, sometimes it differs from company to company and project to project as well. So use your judgment, make it, I usually take 3.5 to 5 or 4 to 5 as very high risk and 2 to 4 as moderate risk. So use your own judgment, and easier way to create a risk register is write down all the items, assign a value on the scale of 1 to 5, 5 being highest, 1 being lowest, assign a weightage, multiply both this into this, you get this number. You add all that, you get the overall score of the project. On the basis of this, you can have a go or no go. Or if it's a no go, you need to put a mitigation plan and then revisit the project. Model 2 is okay. Instead of jumping to another model, this is a risk register. I write down all the name, I give a description of the risk, categorize it, write down the cause, what will cause this disaster. Okay, what is the mitigation plan? You write my mitigation plan is to shift part of the project to other location. Try that. Proposed response. Actually, proposed response is nothing but the mitigation plan itself. Oh, sorry. Mitigation plan is different. Proposed response is if this risk happens, then what I'm going to do. Okay. Basically, this proposed response should come after owner. Who is the owner of that risk? And if this happens, the owner should write what will be his proposed response. What is going to do? Owner's knowledge. As I said, most of the people don't take this component. And then we come directly to what is the probability. On a scale of 1 to 5, as I said, 1 is always lowest, 5 is always highest. Same goes in impact. 1 is always lowest, 3 is always highest. Okay, sorry, 5 is the highest, 3 is in between. So we think that for natural disaster, the probability of that happening is very low, is 1. But if that happens, it'll be 5. The impact will be 5. So the risk value of this particular item is 20, right? The overall risk value is 3.1. 3.1, don't go by green, this is not 3.1. It's a moderate risk project. If it was above 3.5 to 5, I would have taken it as higher risk project. So right now it is 3.1. I have not done the conditional formatting. You can do it your way. So these are the two risk models which are very prevalent. One is this way of making is when you don't have much of time. But the ideal way is you make it like this. You write all the risk. Let me copy paste it for you. Let's see. You copy this. You copy it and you paste it over here. Okay. And you do it. And you do it like this. Okay. This was not the. Okay, the formula is equals sum of all the parameters of all the risk factors raised to the power 1 by 4. So it's 2. The risk of this overall project is 2. Why I'm getting 2 is I've put in a different kind of different parameters, and it's generating a random number because I don't want to put the numbers on my own as we are doing a dummy project. In a real case, you will assign, let's say it's a multi-project, multi-practice project, or let's say the complexity. Okay, let's take this particular row as an example. Let me mark it yellow. Complexity of this project. Let's say we have got an airline project, and complexity of designing this particular project will be, probability will be very high, correct? Impact is if this goes wrong, impact will be high. Mitigation factor. How much effort I'm going to put to mitigate this? Now, to mitigate this risk, I need to have high quality of people. Maybe if they are not available in the organization, I might have to hire them. And as they are expert on certain things, they might not be readily available. The cost will be high, the joining time will be high, correct? The training will be difficult. So the overall mitigation factor, the effort it's going to take will be high. So I mark it 5. And knowledge factor. How much knowledge as a risk owner do I have on this complexity of the project that I am capable enough to assign these numbers correctly? I think I have fairly good knowledge, so I will assign it 4. I am not saying that I am expert, I am marking it 1. If I'm expert, it means these numbers are right. Okay. But I think I have moderate understanding, so I mark it 3. So my overall risk probability and the weightage is only 5. These are just a dummy number. Let me change the weightage. So right now we have 45. Let's make it 50. Okay. Now what's the total? 90. Let's make it 15 this. Now you see, we have total weightage of 100. The complexity, there are many risks, but the risk because of this particular parameter is 50%. The weightage is very high, and because of this, the skills and expertise is 15%. Rest everything is 5, right? So the risk component which has the highest is this, and the other one is this. So new client, yeah. So this factor, if I just highlight, it's a new client, and we don't have very good long-term relationship. So we need to make sure that we are delivering a good values. So that's why we see that total risk probability is coming as 15. So these 3 areas that I definitely should bring in front of my leadership team, right? These are the areas that we should definitely make sure we are doing good. Now the overall risk of the project is coming 3. It's still a go ahead, right? So there are other risk models as we discussed in during the PPT. Let me go to the full screen mode. So we discussed this model which is on the basis of probability and impact. The second risk model that we discussed was on the basis of probability and weightage. And the last risk model that we discussed was on the basis of probability, impact, mitigation factor, knowledge, and weightage. I use this, but sometimes I have to omit knowledge part depending on the situation. The time I omit the knowledge part, I actually directly jump onto which part? Which is the fifth model. Fifth model is based on probability, impact, mitigation, and weightage. You see, the yellow line is probability, impact, and mitigation factor. All 3 club in, and then we have weightage. Okay. Now, as we discussed, the formula of that particular risk is raised to the power 1 by 4. I'm not going to discuss that in detail, that how or what goes behind, like how this formula was derived. But when you have 5 parameters, this is how it works. Another thing that you have to keep in mind, whenever you have weightage in your risk model, you need to do sum. You have to sum up all the risk factors or risk values. But if you do not have weightage in your risk model, you have to average out all the risk values. Whether you are raising it by what power, that depends upon number of variables you are taking into picture. Let me repeat. Whenever you have weightage in your risk model, you have to sum. Whenever you do not have weightage in your model, you need to do average of all the risk values. Whether you are raising it by power of 1 2 like 1 by 2, 1 by 3, 1 by 4, 1 by 5 and stuff. That depends upon number of variables you have in your risk model. There is another training that I have where I am discussing only on risk models. You might want to join that. It's a continuation of this where I have discussed all the 6 different risk models and when to use which one and how did we arrive on a particular how did we arrive the particular risk equation. One thing yet that you have to understand that you don't go ahead and do basic multiplication to the stuff. Your risk calculation might look fairly good, but when you will scale it up, it will fail completely. One of the most important thing is you have to make sure that your risk scale is on 1 to 5. In all the situation, your risk model should fall in the scale of 1 to 5. If you're like whatever equation you're using, this thing you have to keep in mind. Okay. So let's take a quick look what we discussed. Risk is something that is uncertain and in the future, and we need to make sure that we have an action plan around it to reduce its, if not likelihood, at least to reduce its impact. Now, impact can be positive or can be negative. To reduce the impact, we have a mitigation plan in place, correct? And anything, sometimes risk become issue. High risk was 2 people will drop the paper in the future. Now they have already dropped. When we get into the future after 2 months, these guys drop the paper. Now it becomes an issue, right? For risk, we create a register. For issue, we create a log. They're different risk governance model. Informal model where you use the good policy based when is a single policy, custom based when it depends upon project to project. Hybrid model is when you have a single policy and you have a custom model as well. The hybrid model. Most of the IT industries are using the hybrid model. Now, how do we respond to the risk? Avoid it, mitigate it, transfer it, like take the insurance, accept it. Like I accept it. I'm going to drive a bike. Risk mitigation we discussed. Qualitative, quantitative way, what are the risk register? And I'm not going to definition again. Components of risk register, I'm sure you know it by now. Leadership risk, it's a very important part. Steps to create a risk register, identify the risk, write the description, what's the probability, how much damage it will do, how do we create our risk response strategy, like what is the mitigation plan, have we documented it, how are we communicating with the stakeholders, because sometimes stakeholder will tell you what to do and what not to do. Risk mitigation process, make sure that you do the benefit assessment. You cannot imply a control to reduce the impact and then you find the control measure is costing you much more than what the impact would have been, right? So assess the benefit, the cost, and then check out the residual risk. And we discussed the various risk models. All right, guys, this is Devansh. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.